April 27, 1944. A young Jewish woman walks past an SS guard at Auschwitz-Birkenau, speaking perfect German, her blonde hair catching the afternoon light. The guard nods. She keeps walking. Within hours, she'll be outside the camp's electrified fences, carrying secrets that could save thousands. But one wrong word, one slight accent slip, one moment of fear showing in her eyes, and she's dead. Now, before we go any further into this story, I need you to grab something to drink, maybe some coffee. Settle into your chair because what you're about to hear, it's going to take us deep into one of the darkest chapters in human history. And I need you to stay with me until the end because this woman's story, it matters. It still matters today. If you find yourself pulled into this, hit that subscribe button because stories like these, they need to be remembered. They need to be told. All right, let's begin. Auschwitz. Even saying the name, it carries weight, doesn't it? By 1944, this place had become the largest killing center in Nazi Germany's machinery of death. Over 1 million people would die there, most of them Jewish men, women, and children. The camp sprawled across Poland, divided into sections. Auschwitz I, the original camp. Auschwitz II Birkenau, the extermination center with its gas chambers and crematoria. And Auschwitz III Monowitz, where prisoners were worked to death in factories. When you arrived at Birkenau, you came by train. Cattle cars, packed so tight you could barely breathe. The journey could take days. No food, no water, no bathrooms. People died standing up, held upright by the press of bodies around them. And when those doors finally opened, when you stumbled out onto that platform, you faced what they called the selection. Dr. Josef Mengele often stood there, this figure in an SS uniform, sometimes whistling opera, pointing left or right with his thumb. Left meant the gas chambers, usually within hours. Right meant you were strong enough to work, for now. Children, the elderly, pregnant women, anyone who looked weak or sick, left. Most people who arrived at Auschwitz, they never even entered the camp proper. They went straight from the train platform to the gas chambers. 20, maybe 30 minutes later, they were dead. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because to understand how someone could escape this place by pretending to be German, you need to understand something crucial about the Nazi system. It wasn't just chaos and violence, though there was plenty of that. It was also bureaucratic, organized. The Nazis kept meticulous records. They had paperwork for everything: identity documents, work assignments, transfers between camps. And in that bureaucracy, there were cracks, small cracks, barely visible. But for someone brave enough, clever enough, desperate enough, those cracks could mean the difference between life and death. Let me take you back further, to before the camps, to understand who these people were who would attempt something so dangerous. In the 1930s, across Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Jewish families lived normal lives. They were doctors, teachers, shop owners, students. They spoke German. They were part of their communities, some for generations. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, things changed gradually at first. Laws restricting where Jews could work, where they could go to school, who they could marry. Then came Kristallnacht, in November 1938, the night of broken glass, when Nazi paramilitaries destroyed thousands of Jewish businesses and synagogues across Germany and Austria. But even then, most people couldn't imagine what was coming. How could you imagine Auschwitz? How could anyone imagine industrial murder on that scale? By 1949, when Germany invaded Poland, there were millions of Jews living in Eastern Europe. The Nazis forced them into ghettos first, walled-off sections of cities where they were packed together, starved, worked. The Warsaw Ghetto alone held over 400,000 people in an area of just 1.3 square miles. Disease was rampant, people died in the streets. And then, starting in 1941, the deportations began, to camps, to places like Auschwitz. Some Jewish families, seeing what was coming, tried to hide. They found non-Jewish friends or neighbors willing to shelter them, risking their own lives. Others obtained false papers, documents claiming they were Catholic or Protestant, German or Polish Christians. These papers could cost everything a family had, and they didn't always work. The Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, they were good at spotting fakes. They knew what to look for. The wrong type of paper, the wrong stamps, the wrong signatures. And even if your papers were perfect, you had to become someone else, completely. You had to know Catholic prayers if you claimed to be Catholic. You had to know the right German dialects, the right mannerisms, the right way to walk past a soldier without your fear showing. One mistake and you were discovered. One person recognizing you from before the war, one suspicious neighbor, one child who didn't understand they had to lie, and the entire house of cards collapsed. The punishment for Jews caught with false papers was immediate. The punishment for non-Jews helping them hide was often the same. Entire families were sent to camps for helping a single Jewish person. Now, inside Auschwitz itself, the idea of escape seemed almost impossible. The camp was surrounded by electrified barbed wire fences. Guard towers stood every few hundred feet, manned by SS soldiers with machine guns and searchlights. Dogs patrolled the perimeter. Beyond the fences, even if you somehow got that far, you were in occupied Poland. The local population was terrorized, and many had been taught to report escaped prisoners. Where would you go? Who would help you? You were dressed in striped prisoner clothing. Your head was shaved. You were emaciated from starvation. You stood out immediately. The SS made examples of anyone caught trying to escape. Public hangings in the camp, forcing other prisoners to watch. And they had a policy. If someone escaped, they would kill 10 other prisoners from the same barracks as collective punishment. So even attempting escape meant condemning others to death. But people still tried. Between 1940 and 1945, there were over 800 documented escape attempts from Auschwitz. Most failed. Many of those who did get outside the fences were caught within days and brought back for execution. Some died trying, shot by guards or electrocuted on the fences. And yet, some succeeded. We know that at least 144 prisoners successfully escaped from Auschwitz and survived the war. Think about that number. Out of 1.1 million people murdered there, out of the hundreds of thousands who passed through as prisoners, 144 made it out alive by escaping. Each one of those escapes was different. Some prisoners hid in supply trucks leaving the camp. Some dressed as SS guards using stolen uniforms. Some had help from Polish resistance fighters on the outside. A few, incredibly, cut through the fences at night and ran. But the escapes we're talking about today, these involved something different. These involved Jewish prisoners who could pass as non-Jewish, as German even, who used that ability to walk out in plain sight. Picture this. You're a young Jewish woman, maybe 18, maybe 22 years old. Before the war, you grew up in Germany or Austria. You spoke German as your first language, the same as any other German child. You went to German schools, at least until the laws changed. You knew German culture, German customs, German songs. You looked German. Light hair, light eyes, features that didn't match the Nazis' grotesque caricatures of what Jews supposedly looked like. When you were arrested, when you were deported to Auschwitz, you survived the selection because you were young and looked healthy. They sent you to the barracks. They shaved your head. They tattooed a number on your arm. They gave you the striped uniform. You became a prisoner number, not a name. But inside, you still had something most prisoners didn't have. You had a perfect command of German. Not Yiddish, not accented German, but the real thing. High German, the German of educated people. And you knew knowledge. You knew how Germans behaved, how they spoke to each other, what they expected. Now, the Nazis employed prisoners in various work details throughout the camp. Some sorted belongings taken from people sent to the gas chambers. Some worked in the kitchens. Some were assigned to administrative work, keeping those meticulous records the Nazis loved. These jobs, they were sought after because they meant being indoors, maybe getting slightly more food, having some small chance of survival. If you were intelligent, if you spoke good German, you might get assigned to work in offices. This meant contact with SS personnel, with German civilian workers who came to the camp. It meant access to paperwork, to documents, to the mechanics of how the camp administration functioned. And here's where it gets interesting. The Nazi system, for all its evil efficiency, had a fundamental weakness. It assumed Jewish prisoners were fundamentally different from Germans, subhuman in their twisted ideology. They assumed no Jew could ever truly pass as German, that Jewishness was somehow visible, obvious, racial. They were wrong. There were cases, documented cases, of Jewish prisoners who managed to obtain or forge identity papers claiming they were German. Sometimes these papers came from the camp resistance networks. Yes, there was resistance inside Auschwitz, prisoners helping each other, sabotaging when they could, trying to document what was happening so the world would know. Sometimes the papers came from sympathetic German civilians, though these were rare. Sometimes they were stolen from the camp administration itself. With papers claiming you were German, and with the ability to speak and act German convincingly, you had a chance. A slim chance, but a chance. You could claim you were a civilian worker who had accidentally been rounded up. You could claim you were an ethnic German from Poland or Czechoslovakia, what the Nazis called Volksdeutsche. You could create a story that might, just might, stand up to initial scrutiny. The key was confidence. If you acted like a prisoner, like you expected to be beaten or killed, they would see through you instantly. But if you acted like someone who belonged there, someone who had every right to be walking through that gate, human psychology does strange things. Guards who saw hundreds of terrified prisoners every day, they might not look too closely at someone who seemed confident, who spoke to them in proper German, who had paperwork. One documented case that illuminates this involves a woman named Mala Zimetbaum. Now, Mala's story doesn't end in successful escape, but it shows how this was possible. Mala was a Belgian Jew who spoke multiple languages fluently, including German and Polish. In Auschwitz, she became a runner, a prisoner who delivered messages between different sections of the camp. This gave her freedom of movement most prisoners never had. In June 1944, Mala and her boyfriend, another prisoner named Edek Galinski, who was in the camp resistance, decided to escape. Edek obtained an SS uniform. Mala got civilian clothes and papers identifying her as a German woman. They simply walked out of the camp during the day, Edek dressed as a guard escorting Mala, who appeared to be a German civilian. They made it out. They were free for nearly 2 weeks, hiding in the Polish countryside, trying to reach the Slovakian border. But someone recognized them, or someone informed on them, and they were caught. The SS brought them back to Auschwitz for public execution. But here's what matters for our story. When Mala was standing on the gallows, moments from death, she pulled out a razor blade she'd hidden and slashed her wrists. An SS man tried to stop the bleeding, and she struck him in the face. Even dying, she resisted. They shot her before they could hang her. Mala Zimetbaum became a legend in the camp, a symbol of resistance. And her method of escape, walking out by pretending to be German, it proved the concept worked. If she and Edek had made it just a bit further, if luck had been slightly more on their side, they would have survived. There were others. After the war, researchers and survivors documented cases of Jewish prisoners who successfully used false German identity to escape. Some of these stories are known in detail, others are fragmentary, references in testimony, mentions in documents, names without full stories attached. One woman, her name sometimes given as Ruth, sometimes as Regina in different accounts, she worked in the camp administration office. She had access to blank forms, to stamps, to the materials needed for identity documents. She carefully, over weeks, created papers for herself: a German identity card, a work permit, documents claiming she was a civilian secretary who had been mistakenly processed as a prisoner. She picked a day when she knew certain guards would be on duty, guards who were less meticulous, who might be tired or distracted. She dressed in clothes she had obtained, not prisoner stripes, but a simple dress, worn but civilian. She did something about her hair, maybe a wig or a scarf arranged to hide that it had been shaved, and she walked to the gate. In German, perfect German, she explained to the guard there had been a terrible mistake. She was Fräulein so-and-so, a civilian employee, and through some bureaucratic error, she'd been kept in the camp for days. Here were her papers. She needed to leave immediately. She had work to do in town. The guard looked at the papers. They looked official. The stamps were right. And this woman, she didn't look like the starving, terrified Jewish prisoners he was used to. She looked German. She sounded German. She acted annoyed, put upon by the inconvenience, the way a German civilian might act. He let her through. She walked, not too fast, not too slow, down the road leading away from Auschwitz. Every second, she expected to hear shouting behind her, gunshots. But there was nothing. She reached a village. She kept walking. By nightfall, she had put miles between herself and the camp. She survived the war. After liberation, she testified about what she'd experienced, though she was careful about revealing exactly how she had escaped, because other people might still need to use similar methods, and she didn't want the SS learning all the details. These escapes required preparation. You couldn't just decide one day to walk out. You needed documents, and creating or obtaining documents in Auschwitz was incredibly dangerous. If you were caught with false papers, even in the process of making them, you'd be tortured to reveal who else was involved, then killed. You needed appropriate clothes. Prisoner uniforms were immediately recognizable. You had to obtain civilian clothing somehow, stolen from the warehouses where they kept belongings taken from murdered prisoners maybe, or smuggled in by a civilian worker who was part of the resistance. These clothes couldn't be too fine, that would look suspicious, but they had to be normal enough that you'd blend in. You needed your appearance to match. If your head was shaved, you needed to hide that. If you were emaciated, you needed to somehow not look like you were starving, which was nearly impossible. If you had the tattooed number on your arm, you had to keep it covered. And you needed the psychological strength to pull it off. Imagine the terror. You're walking past guards who have absolute power over life and death. You've seen these same guards beat prisoners to death for minor infractions. You've seen them select people for the gas chambers. And now you're pretending to be one of them, to be German, to be free. Your heart must have been pounding so hard you thought they could hear it. Your hands must have been shaking, but you couldn't show any of that. You had to act calm, normal, even bored. Some women who attempted this had advantages. If you'd worked in camp administration, you knew the routines. You knew when guards changed shifts, when inspections happened, when there might be gaps in surveillance. If you'd worked in the camp's sorting detail, going through belongings of murdered prisoners, you had access to items that could be useful: civilian clothes, jewelry that could be traded, documents.
The SS employed some prisoners as translators because they needed people who spoke multiple languages. These prisoners had slightly more freedom of movement and more contact with German personnel. They could observe, they could plan, they could wait for opportunities. But even with all the preparation, it came down to seconds. That moment at the gate, facing the guard. If he decided to check more carefully, if he made a phone call to verify your story, if another SS officer walked up and recognized you as a prisoner, it was over. Let's talk about what happened after someone successfully got outside the camp. Because escaping Auschwitz was only the first step. You were now alone in Nazi-occupied Poland. You had no money, probably, no contacts, no safe place to go. The entire country was under brutal occupation. The Gestapo was everywhere. The Polish underground resistance existed, but finding them without getting caught or betrayed was nearly impossible. If you were Jewish and pretending to be German, you had a strange advantage. Speaking German, having German papers, you could move more freely than most people in occupied Poland. The Nazis treated ethnic Germans better, gave them privileges. You might be able to take a train, check into a boarding house, buy food. But you were also in incredible danger. Every interaction with German authorities was a test. Every checkpoint, every document inspection, every random question from an SS officer. And you were still visibly underfed, probably. You might have health problems from months or years of camp conditions. You had to hide the tattoo on your arm constantly. Some escapees headed for the Slovakian border because Slovakia had pockets of resistance and partisan activity. Some tried to reach Hungary, which until 1944 had been relatively safer for Jews. Some attempted to get false papers claiming they were Polish Christians and blend into the local population. A few, incredibly, headed toward Germany itself. The thinking was that no one would expect an escaped Jewish prisoner to go deeper into Nazi territory, so there might be less scrutiny. In German cities, if you could find work and housing, if your papers held up, you might hide in plain sight until the war ended. The psychological toll must have been unimaginable. You'd escaped death, but you couldn't relax for a second. Every knock on the door could be the Gestapo. Every person you met could be an informer. You were living a lie, constantly, every minute of every day. You couldn't tell anyone the truth. You couldn't let your guard down. And you carried guilt, survivor's guilt. You'd gotten out, but what about everyone else? What about family members who'd been sent to the gas chambers? What about friends still in the camp? Some escapees tried to get information about Auschwitz to the Allies, to resistance groups, hoping that if the world knew the truth, something would be done. Usually, nothing was done. The killing continued. By late 1944, the Soviet army was advancing from the east. The Germans knew they were losing. Inside Auschwitz, the SS began destroying evidence. They blew up crematoria. They burned documents. They forced prisoners on death marches, evacuating the camp, driving thousands of people westward in the middle of winter. Many died on these marches, shot if they couldn't keep up, or simply collapsing from exhaustion and cold. Auschwitz was liberated by Soviet forces on January 27, 1945. They found about 7,000 prisoners still alive in the camp, those too sick to be marched away. The Soviets found mountains of belongings, over 800,000 women's outfits, over 340,000 men's suits, tens of thousands of pairs of shoes, thousands of pounds of human hair that had been shaved from corpses and baled up for industrial use. After the war ended, survivors began telling their stories. Some had been liberated from camps. Some had hidden for years with false identities. Some had escaped and survived in the woods or with resistance groups. And some, like the women we've been discussing, had walked out of Auschwitz by becoming someone else. These stories are difficult to verify in every detail. Many of the people involved died, either during the war or in the decades since. Nazi records were deliberately destroyed. Survivors themselves sometimes had fragmented memories, trauma making it hard to recall exact dates or names. Some survivors were afraid to tell their full stories, worried about being judged for how they survived. But we know it happened. We know Jewish prisoners escaped by pretending to be German. We have testimony. We have post-war interviews and written accounts. We have the courage of people who refused to accept death, who used every tool available to them, including their command of German language and culture, to stay alive. Think about what it means. These women, they'd been stripped of everything. Their homes taken, their families murdered, their identities erased, reduced to a number tattooed on their arm. They were supposed to die. The Nazi plan was for every Jew to die. And yet they found cracks in the system. They used the Nazis' own bureaucracy against them. They turned their knowledge of German culture, which the Nazis claimed made them even more dangerous because they could blend in, into a survival tool. They walked out of hell by pretending to be their persecutors. There's a bitter irony in it. The Nazi ideology said Jews were racially distinct, that you could identify Jews by appearance, that Jewishness was biological destiny. But their ideology was a lie. Jews came in every appearance, every coloring, every type. Some could and did pass as non-Jewish, and when survival depended on it, some used that ability to escape. It doesn't diminish their courage. If anything, it adds another layer to it. They weren't just risking death if caught escaping, which all escapees risked. They were risking torture and interrogation if the Nazis discovered they'd been fooled, that a Jew had pretended to be German. The psychological strength required to maintain that deception, to speak German to SS guards, to act confident and entitled while your heart was breaking for everyone you'd lost, I can't imagine it. After liberation, some survivors continued using their false German identities for a time. The immediate post-war period was chaos. Displaced persons camps were overflowing. Finding family members, if any had survived, was difficult. Some survivors stayed German until they could figure out where to go, how to rebuild their lives. Others immediately reclaimed their Jewish identities. They'd been forced to hide who they were, and now, finally, they were free to be themselves again. They could say the prayers their families had said. They could remember the dead. They could tell their stories. The Holocaust wasn't ancient history. It was 80 years ago. Some survivors are still alive today, though their numbers dwindle every year. Their testimonies are preserved in archives, in video recordings, in written memoirs. These accounts include stories of resistance, of escape, of survival against impossible odds. Why does this matter now? Why am I telling you this story? Because it reminds us of what humans are capable of, both the worst and the best. The Nazis created a system designed to murder millions efficiently, and they succeeded in murdering 6 million Jews, along with millions of others: Roma people, disabled people, political prisoners, Soviet POWs, gay people, so many others. But even in that system, even in Auschwitz itself, the darkest place in that dark time, people resisted, people helped each other, people found ways to survive, people escaped. Every person who walked out of Auschwitz by any means was a victory against the Nazi death machine. Every person who survived to testify, to have children, to live a full life, they won. They denied the Nazis their goal of total extermination. The women who pretended to be German to escape were ordinary people pushed to extraordinary circumstances. They weren't trained spies or soldiers. They were young women, teenagers, some of them, who'd grown up going to school and playing with friends and thinking about their futures. And then the nightmare began. They could have given up. Many people did give up in the camps. The despair was so crushing. But these women fought back in the way available to them. They used their intelligence, their language skills, their ability to understand and mimic German behavior. They planned carefully. They took terrible risks, and some of them made it out. If you could speak to them now, these survivors, what would they say? Based on their testimonies, based on what survivors have shared over the decades, they'd probably tell you they were lucky, that luck played a huge role, that many people just as brave, just as clever, just as determined, died anyway. They'd tell you they think about the others constantly, the ones who didn't make it, the faces they remember from the barracks, from the work details, from the selection platform. They'd tell you they survived partly for them, to bear witness, to make sure the world knows what happened. They'd tell you to never forget. That's the phrase you hear over and over from Holocaust survivors, never forget. Because it happened once, this industrial murder, this genocide, and if we forget how it happened, if we forget that it was done by ordinary people who convinced themselves Jews were less than human, it could happen again. It has happened again, in different places, to different peoples. They tell you that hatred starts small. It starts with words, with propaganda, with teaching people to see others as different, as dangerous, as less deserving of life. And then it grows. The Nazis didn't start with gas chambers. They started with discrimination, with laws, with rhetoric dehumanizing Jews, and then it escalated. They tell you to recognize humanity in everyone, to refuse to see people as categories, to remember that every person has a story, a family, hopes, fears, complexity. The stories of Jews who escaped camps by using false German identities are part of a larger tapestry of Holocaust survival stories. There were thousands of ways people tried to survive. Some succeeded, most didn't. But every story matters. There were Jewish children hidden by non-Jewish families who raised them as their own. There were people who spent years in attics or cellars. There were partisan fighters in the forests. There were people who obtained false papers and lived under assumed names in cities. There were people who survived death marches. There were people who lasted in the camps until liberation. Each survival story is unique. Each involved courage, luck, help from others, timing, 100 factors that had to align. There's no hierarchy of suffering or survival. Someone who hid their identity and walked out of a camp wasn't braver or more deserving than someone who survived by enduring until liberation. They all faced death. They all survived. That's what matters. But the stories of escapes by assuming German identity have a particular poignancy, because they involve becoming, temporarily, the enemy, speaking their language, wearing their clothes, acting by their rules. It's a kind of resistance through mimicry, through using the oppressor's own tools and assumptions against them. These women knew that the Nazis saw Germans as superior, as the master race, so they became German, on paper, in speech, in behavior, and it worked just enough, just sometimes, to save lives. Let me bring this back around. April 27, 1944, a young Jewish woman walks past an SS guard at Auschwitz. She's speaking perfect German. She has papers. She has a story. Her heart is pounding, but her face is calm. The guard looks at her papers, looks at her face. He nods. She walks through the gate. She's free. She doesn't know if she'll survive the next hour, the next day, the next week. She doesn't know if someone will recognize her, if her papers will fail the next inspection, if luck will run out. But right now, in this moment, she's outside the fences. She's alive. She walks down the road. Behind her, Auschwitz continues its terrible work. The trains arrive, the selections happen, the gas chambers operate. Thousands die that day, like every day. But she's walking away. She's carrying something the Nazis tried to destroy. Hope. the possibility of survival, the chance to witness. We don't know exactly how many women successfully used this method to escape. The records are incomplete. Some survivors never told the full story. Some died before they could share what they knew. But we know it happened. We know some made it. And that's why this story matters. Not because it was common, it wasn't. Not because it was easy, it was terrifying and nearly impossible. But because it happened at all. Because even in the darkest place imaginable, even when every system was designed to kill, even when the odds were impossibly stacked against survival, some people found a way. They found cracks in the system. They used their intelligence and courage. They refused to give up, and some of them walked out of Auschwitz alive. Their stories are part of the historical record now. They're preserved in testimony, in written accounts, in the archives of Holocaust research institutions. They're studied by historians trying to understand the full scope of how people survived. They're part of what we remember when we say, never forget. This isn't an easy story to tell. The Holocaust isn't an easy topic. But it's necessary, because these events happened. These were real people, real lives, real deaths, real suffering, and real courage. The women who escaped by pretending to be German were real. Their fear was real. Their intelligence and bravery were real. And the lessons remain real, about what humans can do to each other when hatred is allowed to grow unchecked, about what ordinary people become when they're taught to see others as less than human, about the importance of resistance, even when resistance seems futile, about courage in the face of overwhelming evil. You've stayed with me through the story. That means something. It means you care about history, about truth, about remembering. It means these lives, these stories, they matter to you too. The survivors who lived to tell these stories, they did it for you. They testified so you would know. They wrote their memoirs so future generations would understand. They gave interviews, spoke at schools, dedicated their later lives to education, all so we wouldn't forget. So now you know. You know that some Jewish prisoners walked out of Auschwitz by pretending to be German. You know it required perfect German language skills, forged documents, incredible courage, and luck. It worked sometimes, not often, but sometimes. And you know that even in the darkest moment in modern history, even in the place designed to be the end of hope, hope survived, courage survived, humanity survived. That's what we remember. That's what we carry forward.